Ladies and gentlemen, hello. The INHA and the Chateau de Fontainebleau are happy to welcome you for this 9th Festival of Art History. The next presentation is called A Nation Reclaims Its Treasures, a debate over the Icelandic medieval manuscripts, presented by Guðmundur Hafdanarsson of the University of Iceland.
It's a great honor to be here in this fantastic environment. The chateau is beautiful, it is magnificent and very different from the buildings in Iceland, so we don't have anything like this. And actually one of the reasons why Iceland was able to reclaim some of its manuscripts from Denmark was the fact that the Danes, they felt sorry for Icelanders not to have any buildings. We only had these manuscripts, so let them have it. So what I'm going to talk about here in this session, which is about restitution of cultural artifacts and the question of cultural heritage, if cultural heritage is something that belongs to a certain place or not. And there is one specific case that I am going to look at, and that is the debates between Iceland and Denmark, starting in the first half of the last century, dealing with a great treasure of Icelandic manuscripts, medieval manuscripts that were kept in Danish libraries and collections. And I will start the story on the 17th of June 1944. On that day, Iceland founded its republic at the historical place Þingvellir, which is to the south of Reykjavik. This foundation of the republic kind of ended over 6 centuries of relationship with the Danish monarchy. So this happened during the Second World War. Iceland was under American military, not occupation, but rather protection, because it came through an agreement between the government of Iceland and the United States in July 1941, before the United States entered the war. They came to relieve the British military forces in Iceland simply because the British military was needed elsewhere. This was, at this time, Denmark was still under German occupation, so there had been no relations between Iceland and Denmark for over 4 years. And this is 11 days after D-Day, 75 years ago. And at the same day as the Icelanders declared the republic, the Free French troops landed on the island of Elba. So this is a very particular time in the history of Europe. Right after the war, because Iceland declared to become a republic in 1944, there had been no negotiations with Denmark at that time, simply because there were no relationship between Denmark and Iceland during the war. So right after the war, an Icelandic delegation was sent to Copenhagen to make the divorce settlement, to settle the kind of division of the two places. And one of the most important issue for the Icelandic delegation were the manuscripts, Icelandic manuscripts in Denmark. And as it was declared in the Icelandic newspaper Morgunblaðið at this time, they said Iceland's first and strongest wish is the return to Iceland of the old Icelandic manuscripts. This was totally rejected by the Danish government in the beginning. They were seen as not only valuable for Iceland, they were also valuable for Denmark. And the Icelandic government thought that Iceland didn't have the kind of scientific knowledge, conditions or to preserve these manuscripts or to research them. And thirdly, the Danish government thought that Iceland had no legal right to claim these treasures. And what started then was a long legal battle between Iceland and Denmark, and also internal battle in Denmark. And I'm going to talk about this kind of debate and try to place it in the kind of general context of restitution of this type in the world now. So what was this debate about? I mean, the center of the debate were large collections of Icelandic manuscripts kept in 2 major Danish collections. One in the so-called Anne Magniana collection, owned by the University of Copenhagen, and the other in the Royal Library of Copenhagen. These manuscripts were remnants of a very vibrant cultural activity in Iceland during the Middle Ages. And I'm going to talk about why these manuscripts were in Copenhagen. I'm also talking about and explaining the Icelandic demands. And finally, I'm going to talk about the Danish responses. And at the end, I will talk a little bit about the solution and how we can place the solution in the international debates. Can we look at the solution as a paradigm or good practice for similar cases? So that is a question I will deal with at the end. If you look at the historical background, what are these manuscripts? Then we can say that Iceland was settled fairly late. The first settlers coming to Iceland came to Iceland in the 9th century, late 9th century. They came mostly from Norway, coming through the British Isles. So it has been calculated through genetic research, I have no idea how they can do it, that the great majority of the men came from Norway, but the great majority of the women came from the British Isles. They're able to figure that out. But this kind of reflects that the settlement of Iceland was a part of the general expansion of the Nordic countries, or the Scandinavian countries in the Viking period. So the Norwegians were going to the west, while the Swedes were going down to the east, down to Russia. Iceland, in the beginning, Iceland had no kind of state. Around 930, there was Alþingi was founded with was a kind of court for the whole country where the chieftains met. There was no organized state until the 13th century in the country. Iceland converts to Christianity around 1000, and that is very important for this story because with Christianity comes the technology of writing. Until Christianity, Icelanders did not know how to write, but the technology of writing comes with Christianity, with the monasteries and with the Christian culture. The first written material in Iceland were the legal codes. Until the 12th century, all the legal codes had been remembered. Oral culture was the only way of remembering. And the law book that was written down, it still exists, it is about this thick. And so the lawman had to remember the whole book and recited it in 3 cycles at Alþingi. And I'm sure that he was pretty glad when he got this kind of technology of he could simply write it down, so he didn't have to remember it anymore. But it develops in the 12th century into writing chronicles about Icelandic history, and mostly this is written in Icelandic or Old Norse in the vernacular, not in Latin. So in the 1260s, Iceland becomes a part of the Norwegian monarchy through a contract between Icelandic chieftains and Norway. And in the late 14th century, Iceland becomes part of the Danish monarchy when the Danish and Norwegian crowns merged. So what was this manuscript culture? As I said before, this begins in the 12th century with these legal codes and this kind of historical chronicles. So Icelanders say that they have one of the few European nations that have written history from the beginning. Reflecting the fact that Iceland was settled fairly late. So these chronicles are written in the 12th century, talking about things that were happening 300-400 years before. So they are more stories about the kind of power relations in Iceland than actual histories. But in the 13th century, this culture kind of develops into clear literary period when so-called Icelandic Sagas were written. These are so-called family sagas. These are very complex stories of love, hate, fighting, and all the trappings of life at that time. There are also contemporary sagas describing the things that were happening at the time. There are stories about Norwegian kings because the Icelanders were known for their literary prowess. So the Norwegian king hired Icelanders to write their stories. So most stories of Norwegian kings, that the stories of this period in Norway that is known, was written down by Icelanders in the 13th century. And then there are also Norse and Germanic legends that were preserved in Iceland, originally come to Iceland as an oral culture with the Germanic tribes, and then are written down in the 13th century, and this is the reason why these legends are preserved. Wagner, for example, used these legends very much in some of his operas. This literary production continued in Iceland until you could say until the 20th century, this manuscript culture, but its kind of heyday was in the Middle Ages. So why are these manuscripts in Copenhagen? In the 17th century, there is increasing interest in the Icelandic manuscripts and the contents of the manuscripts, both in Sweden and Denmark. So the kings of Sweden and Denmark, they were looking for the stories of the beginning and trying to prove to each other that they were really the most noble royal family in the north. And in Sweden, it's related to what's called Göticism, the idea of that the Swedish kind of line went far back. The Swedes are really founding they're entering their golden age in the 17th century. The Danes, on the other hand, they had the advantage of as Iceland was a Danish dependency, they were able to access this literature in a much better way than the Swedes, although there are a number of these manuscripts now in Uppsala and collected in the 17th century. The most famous of these collectors was Árni Magnússon. He was an Icelandic person who was a professor at the University of Copenhagen that collected a huge number of these manuscripts. And when he died, he gave them to the University of Copenhagen, and that formed the so-called Árni Magnússon Institute in Copenhagen. Denmark and Copenhagen became the center of research and publications of these manuscripts. And remained so until the 20th century, and in many ways remained so even today. The interest in the manuscripts is reawakened, you can say, in the 19th century with the Romantic influence and the Romantic interest in the Old Norse heritage. Johann Gottfried Herder was looking for this, what he called a German national character, which was in a sense kind of alternative to the classical heritage. And for him, these legends that were preserved in the Icelandic manuscripts were signs and symbols and remnants of that culture. And this was very popular, became very popular both in Scandinavia and England. And the sources of this culture were mostly preserved in these manuscripts, and then in particular Codex Regius, which is the manuscript on this picture here. It's a small, rather unseemly manuscript which keeps many of these kind of legends, and in many ways the only source of these legends in the world. So there is a new and revived interest in Icelandic saga literature in the Romantic period, and this is also reflected in Denmark. Because the Danes, they begin to look at Iceland as some kind of, almost as a freezing plant. So they saw Iceland as the place where the Nordic culture had been preserved through the centuries. And there are many quotations that you can find, for example, from the Danish national poet Adam Oehlenschläger, who called Iceland a holy island, the memory's greatest temple, in a poem from 1805. And the politician Ola Lehmann, when he was in a debate in the Danish Parliament on Iceland, he emphasized that for him, he says that he was expressing his veneration for Icelandic culture, which had this justification in our appreciation for what all the inhabitants of the Nordic countries owe to them for faithfully preserving the remnants of the past, which we all must obtain our future hope. So for the Danes, this kind of medieval Icelandic culture was in a sense the beginning of their own national culture. So these stories that were preserved in these manuscripts became an integral part of the formation or the construction of Danish national identity in the 19th century. For Iceland, the manuscripts and the stories in them had, of course, a huge value during the 19th century when the Icelandic national identity is being formed. Icelandic cultural nationalism, it begins in the 1830s. It was based as cultural nationalism in other countries of Europe at the time on sense of language and history. And these manuscripts and these stories were perfect for that kind of construction. Icelandic nationalism was very much reflected very much the formation of the Danish nation state. Denmark is changed from an empire in 3 steps in the 19th century. In 1814, they lose Norway. In the mid-century, they form a democratic state. And in 1864, they lose the so-called duchies of Schleswig and Holstein to Germany. And in a sense, the Danes begin to look inwards from then on, and in many ways begin to define themselves as a cultural nation, defining away dependencies like Iceland. So it was very difficult for Icelanders to feel a part of the new Danish states. They were kind of defined away. So Icelanders begin to develop their own cultural nationalism in reaction to the things that are happening in Denmark. And for them, the medieval literature became the central theme in defining this new cultural nationalism. It was in many ways the raison d'être of the Icelandic nation. In many ways, the manuscript was a double affirmation of the nation, because both it proved for the Icelandic elite that Icelandic culture was something that was important in the European context, at the same time as they looked at the manuscripts as sources of the beginning of Icelandic history. And through the acceptance in Denmark and in Europe in general of this medieval culture, it was seen as acceptance of Icelandic nationality. In many ways, in Denmark, for example, the Danes never doubted the fact that they saw it as a fact that Icelanders were a separate nation because of their strong belief in the Icelandic medieval culture. So in many ways, the medieval manuscripts become a symbol of what people thought that Iceland once was, and then what it could be in the future. Because at the end of the 19th century, Iceland was one of the poorest countries in Europe. It was both economically poor, and it was also socially very backward. In a sense, it was not looking at the manuscripts and the sagas was not a way in saying that we would emulate the past, but by emphasizing the past, the people wanted to saw the path into the future. And just to see the language of these debates, to understand how emotionally charged they were, I have here a quote from the former rector of the University of Iceland. This is a speech that he gave in 1947. The Norwegian crown prince came to Iceland after the war to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the death of Snorri Sturluson, one of the medieval chronicles of Iceland. He was actually killed in 1241, but they couldn't come in 1941, so they came in 1947. And the rector said, I'm just going to read it because I find it so telling. Our forefathers had the fortune of creating classical literature. These literary works are now 7 to 8 centuries old, but they still retain their value. And then not only their artistic or scientific value, as most cultural achievements of the past, but also their organic value. This literature has commonly been regarded as one of the 3 bright lights in history of human intellectual life. It has been placed alongside the Bible and the classical literature of Greece and Rome. So not only European culture, but the world culture had 3 sources, according to the rector. It was, the Middle East of the Christian era. It was the classical literature of Athens or Greece, and then it was Rome. And classical literature of Greece and Rome, and then it was Iceland. So they really believed that this was an important part of cultural history. From this cultural resource, the Icelandic nation has sought its spiritual sustenance through the ages, and in them the nation found a key to its future. The land of the sagas had been our promised land, a beautiful and glorious land, to which we have looked for inspiration in times of need, and to which we have sought strength, courage, and hope. The sagas showed how Iceland was a long time ago, and we have believed that what the country once was, it could become again. So this is the kind of image of this literature in Iceland in the 1940s, and you can just imagine the kind of desire of reclaiming this literature back to Iceland from Denmark when the two countries separate. And they also have here a quote from the celebration on the 17th of June 1944, when the chairman of the parliament declared, "At last the nation has returned home with all of its belongings, sovereign and independent. The political separation from a foreign state has been completed." And the kind of subtext here is that some of the most important belongings were still in Copenhagen, and this was seen as totally untenable situation. So this became one of the main claims and main demands of Iceland in this kind of separation settlement. Okay, so this commission comes to Copenhagen in 1945. The settlement is more or less complete in 1946. The government asked the academic community what will happen if we fulfill the Icelandic request, and they would say that a great majority of medieval manuscripts in Danish collections will disappear, and they were not particularly pleased with that. So what the government did was to decide to form a committee to study the issue in 1947 with politicians and academics. And so their issue was to lay out some of the claims, the kind of legal conditions, and the cultural and moral issues that were involved. Its final report was published in 1951, and they all agreed, all the members of the committee agreed that Iceland had no legal right to these manuscripts. These manuscripts had been legally acquired by the Danish state or Danish collections, and Iceland has really never disputed that issue. But there were quite different opinions on what to do. They all agreed that they had no legal claims, but some of the members, for example, the socialist member of the committee said, "Okay, we give them all back. I mean, this is a colonial heritage. We should get rid of it. Send them all back to Denmark." The conservatives said, "We're not going to send anything. These manuscripts are Danish, and they should not go." So in a sense, there was a middle road that was decided, and that was based on the opinion of four of the academics in the committee, who suggested that some of the manuscripts should be sent to Iceland, and as I said, in our opinion, from the Danish side, on the basis of a common Nordic compassion. So this is framed in this kind of Nordic idea, and as a gift. So this is not something that Iceland had any right to get, but the Danes were willing to give it back. One could submit to Iceland manuscripts which were both written by Icelanders and dealt with Icelandic conditions and persons, and which would therefore be of special interest to Icelanders, and would not in any significant degree be studied by others than Icelandic researchers. And they kind of coined the term kulturæði, or cultural property, and they were ready to agree that the Icelanders had some cultural propriety of some of the manuscripts. And this solution was codified with a law from the Danish Parliament in 1961. where it was kind of based on negotiations between Iceland and Denmark. After all legal hurdles were settled in the Danish Supreme Court in 1971, the manuscripts the first manuscripts were sent to Iceland in April 1971. So what happened was then the manuscript collections were divided. About 60% of the manuscripts were sent to Iceland, and these were all manuscripts that were, as I say, were written in Icelandic or Old Norse, written by Icelanders, and dealt with Icelandic subjects. All the other manuscripts were supposed to be and are still in Copenhagen, dealing with Norwegian history and the old legends. So this is a picture of front page of the largest Iceland newspaper on the day, on the 21st of April 1971. It's a picture of the Danish frigate Veteran transporting the first manuscript to Iceland. I still remember this day. I was 15, and all primary schools were closed for the day, and I was very happy about that. And this was the first TV broadcast the live TV broadcast in Iceland from this when the Veteran and the celebration happened in Reykjavik. And this is a picture of the Danish Minister of Culture handing one of these manuscripts in 2 volumes to his Icelandic counterpart, Gylfi Gislason, saying with the remark, "Vær så god, Fladebøen," here we are, the Book of Flatey. It was a kind of comical or light-hearted end of this bitter dispute. And in a sense, you can say it was symbolically ended then, and I can say it really ended. In a sense, you can say the Icelandic struggle of independence ended on this day. But what can we say about these manuscripts? These manuscripts were cultural heritage in a double manner, than that they're more complex than many other similar pieces, because the debates were both on the content of the manuscripts, on the stories that were described in the manuscripts, but also on the manuscripts themselves as artifacts. And these two things are not the same thing. Because the culture that is contained in the manuscripts is clearly much more than just Icelandic. This is a culture, many of the manuscripts, as I say, describe Germanic, Norwegian, Germanic culture, legends, and Norwegian history. But they were all written in Iceland, so they are, as artifacts, these are originated in Iceland. So the debate was very much on the kind of on who owns the cultural heritage of these manuscripts, and many Danes were quite convinced that this heritage was just as much Danish as it was Icelandic. And here's a quotation from the well-known linguist Louis Hjelmslev, Danish linguist, who said the culture, the religion, the myths, and the legends were a common heritage. They formed the material and content which is transcribed in the great old manuscripts. The Old Norse culture that belongs equally to all the Nordic countries and originate in a time when we felt as one unity. No, and no again. The manuscripts are not Icelandic, they are Nordic. So the content of the manuscripts was pan-Nordic, he said, and therefore there were no specific, not a specific Icelandic cultural heritage. This was not the prevailing attitude in Denmark. And here is another quote from Paul Engberg, who was a schoolmaster of one of the Danish folk high schools. The Danish folk high school movement was very supportive of the Icelandic demands in these debates. And he said, the return of the manuscripts from Denmark to Iceland must be founded on the same vision as Nordic cooperation in general. That is, on the equal position and equal rights of all the Nordic nations. The old imperialistic Denmark, or the Kalmar Union, must give up all of its claims to a superior position in Norden, and thus to hand the manuscript over to Iceland as a gift in order to signal the popular or the folkely equality between Denmark and Iceland. And this was really the prevailing view in Denmark. So the return of the majority of manuscript to Iceland was accepted with great majority in the parliament, and I think the majority of Danes agreed. So as I said before, this case is sometimes seen as a useful paradigm in other debates like this. To quote Janet Greenfield in a book that is kind of very important study of the legal aspects of return of cultural treasures. And he claims, and the Icelandic case is his first case, she explains in great detail in her book, and he sees it as an unusually civilized and rational act. But is it, can it be duplicated? I'm not so sure. This case happened in a very specific historical context, historical and political context. Iceland was not really a colony of Denmark. It was an integral part of the Danish monarchy. So it was part of the so this kind of reclaim of these manuscripts, it was a part of the formation of nation state in Nordic countries. There were no demands from Iceland for the manuscripts in Sweden, for example, or in Oxford. There are many Iceland manuscripts there. This was much more seen as symbolic of the separation of the two nations into two states. And there was very limited interest in Iceland in reclaiming other cultural artifacts in Danish museums. Some of them are given to Iceland in 1930, but many are still in the Danish National Museum, and there are not many who disagree with that. The two countries are now part of the Nordic Council, and it would have been totally impossible not to solve this debate somehow. It simply would not have been possible for the two states to coexist in this kind of close cooperation with some form of solution. So I would say the moral of the story is that there is no one answer to questions of political restitution. Great museums like La Louvre or British Museum or the museums on Museumsinsel in Berlin, there are both symbols of brute imperial force, but they're also symbols of human cultural achievements. So to break them up would be, in many ways, a great loss. So each case in these debates are unique, but the Icelandic case is anyhow an example of that these cases can be solved in agreement. So in spite of strong emotions on both sides, compromise can be found. And now the two institutes, the Anna Magna Institute in Copenhagen and the Anna Magna Institute in Reykjavik, they cooperate firmly. There are firm scientific links with them. So I think that the kind of research on medieval literature has been very beneficial for research, and it's also been very beneficial for the kind of cooperation between the two countries. So compromise is sometimes the best route forwards, but at the same time, I'm not going to say that in any case, in every case, the solution is the same. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, illuminating, and one has to take in consideration, of course, the fact that Iceland already since 1918 was a sovereign state. So it was just in 1944 it became a republic. So I mean it has a specific status within the Danish monarchy. It's good you underline the fact that it's not a colonial relationship in that sense. And that is very important when one discusses the matter of restitution or return. These negotiations concern the return of the medieval manuscripts to Iceland is really a very classical example of restitution, but quite unusual as such. It's not the only case in Scandinavia, actually. You talked about the Nordic kind of tradition, looking upon the legal aspect too. As a matter of fact, when I read history at the University of Lund in south of Sweden, there was a quite interesting case the Danish troops seized quite many important manuscripts in Stockholm in a very bloody period in 1520. but it was returned actually in exactly 400 years afterwards by the Danish National Archive to the Swedish National Archive in Stockholm in 1920. And I would say that in this case, if they would have been kept in Stockholm, they would have been lost now, because more or less all the medieval manuscripts were burnt in the huge fire of the Royal Palace in Stockholm in 1697. So, I mean, you can look upon, it's complicated, this matter. It gives you the complexity of the issue, and sometimes, which is quite awful, the question of restitution is as a victim of chauvinism, of pure chauvinism as well. There is another precedent, another case, speaking about the Icelandic manuscripts, and a comparable example in Sweden. That's actually the gift of the so-called Seidabrevid. Yes, you know, sometimes since we make joke about Icelandic, you just use a Swedish word and you end with a th. So you, just a joke, of course. Yeah. No, and they say that that's the sheep letter from the Faroe Islands. They're from 1298. They were written in Bergen in Norway. They came to the Faroe Islands, and they later appeared again in Bergen in 1599, and then suddenly they appear in Stockholm in the Collegium of the Antiquities in around 1680. We don't know what happened in between. But in 1990, the Swedish Parliament took the decision to return this as a gift. There's no proof of that they were taken as war booty or anything like that. But the Swedish Parliament believed that this was an important act, I think, based on emotional reasons and national identity for the sake of the Faroe Islands. So there is a comparable example between Sweden and the Faroe Islands is part of the Danish monarchy. You want to make a comment?
Just that, I mean, every Icelander in the debate had to admit that the fact that the manuscripts had been taken to Copenhagen probably saved them. They would probably all have been lost because conditions in Icelandic homes were very detrimental to the manuscript. The Icelandic homes in the 17th and 18th century were not really very good places for any type of manuscripts. No. So the fact that they were taken to Copenhagen meant that they were preserved in the best conditions that existed. Some of them were burned in Copenhagen in the fire of 1728, but most of them were saved. So this is often used as a reason to keep the kind of cultural artifacts in the places in these museums, is that they have the best conditions of preserving these pieces. So many of them would have been lost if they would not have been collected by the various collectors in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
It's fascinating what you told us about that. You could the same idea of a shared Nordic cultural heritage, because as you probably know, the Snorre Sturlason's stories about the Norwegian kings that also deals with the Swedish kings of the period, the Viking kings. So it's a heritage we shared, of course, but that you could. The same idea could deliver two different arguments against and for. So that's quite amazing. I'm sure there are questions. There are sûrement des questions si vous voulez poser. Ah. Pas de questions.
No questions? Please make the best of this opportunity.
Oui.
I have a very practical question. Where are these documents preserved now in Iceland?
The manuscripts are now preserved in the Anna Magnan Institute, which is yep. It's on a picture on the bottom. They're actually building a new building. We call it. They started the building in 1907. Then we had a financial crash in 2008. They continued in 2011, dug a hole, but then they stopped again. So we still have the hole, but they're building a new building for it. And then now they promise us that it will be finished in the next few years. But it's kind of related to University of Iceland. So it's a research institute, and you can say, and so in 1954, the Danish government kind of suggested to the Icelanders that the same solution as they came up with a little bit later, but Icelanders had to then to accept that the manuscript would be owned formally by both Iceland and Denmark. They couldn't accept that. So when the law was passed in 1961, nothing was said about the ownership. They simply didn't mention it. So in a sense, Iceland did not have to admit that they had owned it together. But in a sense, this is a double institute. There is an institute in Copenhagen, institute in Iceland, and they're both researching the same manuscript kind of treasure. So because in Copenhagen we have still about 600-700 manuscripts from Iceland. Either they're written in Latin, they are written about Norwegian kings, they're not about Iceland. So religious manuscripts and so on and so forth, which are kept in the old Anna Magnan Institute in Copenhagen. But they tend to cooperate quite nicely together, and there is no hard feelings anymore, I think, between the two. So.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I wanted to know if these manuscripts are digitalized. Are there exchanges between Copenhagen and you? And I'd like to know if the UNESCO has a position about all this, about communication, double possession, double property, etc.
They are now being digitalized, and that is a cooperative project between Copenhagen and Iceland. And the collection is now a part of the UNESCO heritage list. And I think basically UNESCO sees this as very much as a cooperation that could be something that could be emulated elsewhere. And as I underlined, is that I think it was a fantastic solution, a good for both situations. But it's not it's not every case that can be solved in the same manner because of the kind of nature of the relationship between Iceland and Denmark. So yes, UNESCO is very much involved in these things and thinks this is a very good initiative that Iceland and Denmark started there.
It's true that the question of ownership creates a confusion, and also is much related to the idea of chauvinism. I mean, so because it's rather a matter of how to make them accessible. These part of the heritage. I mean, it's what you can really blame would be if they are not accessible. I mean, but I can give another example. That's the so-called Polish scroll that was given back by Sweden to Poland in 1974. What happened really? It's the Polish scroll is It was taken by the Swedish troops in Warsaw in 1655, and it showed the entry of the King Sigismund Vasa, Sigismund III. He was both Swedish King of Sweden and of Poland, and his entry in Krakow in 1605, when he was to be married with the Princess Constantia. And the gift stemmed from a political initiative. It was the state visit of Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1974. So the initiative stemmed from the government, not from the cultural institutions, and which was caused a controversy really in Sweden. But what happened is a bit of a tragedy. The scroll was converted into a series of pictures, a picture gallery. So it was cut into pieces and by the Poles. And the Polish scroll is not anymore a scroll, it's a gallery of pictures. So it's really, it felt victim of this, the nationalistic claim to have it back. And of course, they would have been burnt by the Nazis in the Second World War. But I mean, I don't want to try to argue against the restitution. But I mean, it shows that these matters are quite complicated. I mean, it's not very easy, and if you look at the result, it could be quite dangerous sometimes, like in the case of the Polish scroll. So I'm sure there are other questions in the auditorium. Yes.
Bonjour, vous avez dit que...
Hello, you said that there were other Icelandic artifacts in Denmark, other manuscripts. Now, why was this collection the sign of it was Icelandic? Is it because of the collector or the place where it was found or the original collection? Why did you all focus on those manuscripts?
Artifacts are in the national, for example, in the National Museum in Copenhagen. These are other types of artifacts, you know, kind of. There are chairs and paintings and things that from daily life. It is really the manuscripts because of the literary tradition that became so important. They were seen as symbols of what Icelanders thought was so important of signifying their place in a kind of European pantheon. So in the 19th century, Iceland was, as I said before, very poor. There were a lot of travelers that came to Iceland and very often published books when they came back. There is a fantastic one published by a French traveler called Victor Meignan, called Pauvre Iceland, Poor Iceland. You can find it on the internet. It's really a fantastic book. He thought Iceland was the worst. He couldn't understand why anyone wanted to live in that forsaken country. So this was the kind of idea of Iceland in the 19th century. Iceland had this kind of old past, and one of the questions that Meignan was dealing with is in the book was what had happened to this old culture, and his response was that okay, Iceland was probably a part of Atlantis that had kind of disappeared. So the place of the sagas had sure disappeared into the sea since the Middle Ages. It's a very interesting theory, which I don't think is geologically has been proven. But this is the idea of Iceland. So for the Icelanders to have this kind of cultural remnant and cultural tradition kind of prove that they were important for European culture. So that is why they thought the manuscripts were so important. So they are the symbol of who we are and who we want to be. And this is, of course, a very chauvinistic idea because I didn't write Njál saga. I'm not particularly good writer, so it is. But in the kind of cultural nationalism of the 19th century, this became extremely important in order to prove your place in the world, that you were not. So I often say that Europe, we have to use the concept of Europe with quotation mark, because Europe means two things. Europe means it's a geographic space with certain boundaries, but it's also an idea. And the idea of Europe is civilization. So Iceland wanted to make sure that Iceland was counted in Europe. So the line between Europe and the rest was not in the middle of the North Atlantic between Iceland and the British Isles, but between Iceland and Greenland. The Greenlanders were certainly not part of Europe. Icelanders were very eager to say, and we were not Greenlanders. So it becomes so important in that kind of imperialistic kind of colonial debates of the 19th century and early 20th century. And this is the reason why they became so important for Iceland. That had to come back. You know, the chairs and the pictures, they could be in Copenhagen, you know, that's...
But it seems there was a Danish understanding of the emotional arguments. I mean, that Iceland wanted back its holy grail of the great Nordic heritage. So that is understandable. I mean, yes. That is clearly
the argument of this this report that came out in 1951, which said, you know, that's understandable that Icelanders are really their claim is crazy and it's totally illegal, but it's understandable.
We have a second speaker.
Yes, Donc, merci à nos deux premiers intervenants.
I'd like to thank our first two speakers, and now we're going to go on with our next conference called Restitution, presented by Anne Neoli.
Hi. I got a message to talk slow. My glasses on. I need to, since it's in English, I need to keep to my manuscript. The Sami people live in the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and in northwest Russia. I'm a Northern Sami from Norway. The Sami people can be divided into four main groups across national borders. The main groups are the Southern Sami, who are both in the southern Norway and southern Sweden. Lule Sami is in central Norway and in central Sweden. Northern Sami is in northern Norway, northern Sweden, and northern Finland. Eastern group is entirely in the east of Norway, in the border territories between Finland and Russia, and of course, in Russia. The Sami people are the indigenous people of the Nordic countries, the people of Sápmi. Today, Sami in Norway live as Norwegian citizens. Larger proportion have their means of livelihood in agriculture, fishing, and reindeer herding. Reindeer herding has been one of the Sami traditional occupations and means of livelihood. The Sami were therefore traditionally a semi-nomadic people. As the Norwegian state appropriated Sami territories, we were forced to become more settled. Still, some Sami activities like reindeer herding and some fishing, hunting and gathering activities include elements of our traditional lifestyles. We consider ourselves one people, but we have different Sami dialects. There are also different differences in decor and in our traditional clothing. The Sami traditional clothing is the means of non-verbal communication. By the decor of the gakti, the traditional dresses, we can tell where a person is from, which town or village they are from. In the older days, some patterns in the Sami dress and belt or hairdress could tell about the family and kin relationships. In some places, the form of our silver on our belt can tell you if you're married or not. In these pictures, we can see gakti, the traditional clothes, from Karasjok, Kautokeino, but also from Loppa and also from Kvalsund. So it's differences, but we also have the possibility to have the colors we like or the kind of texture, textile we like. Sami parliaments have been established in all but one of the countries the Sami reside. Norway, Sweden and Finland all have their elected Sami parliaments, while Russian Sami on the Kola Peninsula have not been granted such right. In Norway, the Sami right to protect and maintain their language, culture and way of life was granted by the Constitution in 1988. In 1989, the Sami Parliament was established in Norway, the Sami's own elected political body. Sami Parliament is an advisory institution for the Norwegian government in Sami affairs, but has no legal or executive power. The Sami Parliament has had the administrative responsibility for the Sami organizations and institutions, such as the Sami museums, since 2002. We can say that by the means of the Sami Parliament, the Sami have got self-determination in respect to Sami culture. Sami museums have been established quite recently. They therefore have a short history, and much of what is known about us is of recent date. Ridderdotter-museet is a museum association which I am a director. Ridderdotter-museum, it means from the coast to the tundra museums. We consist of 4 museums and one art magazine or art collection. One of the museums is the oldest Sami museum in Norway. Its name is Sami Vorkadaverat in our own language, meaning the Sami collection. It was opened in 1972, but already in 1958, some old buildings were moved to and rebuilt in the area where the museum is today. Thus, the museum was first an outdoor museum. As a semi-nomadic people, the Sami did not have much of the material possessions. People had what they needed, and it was used until it could no longer be used. Only when the Sami became more settled, material culture became more present in each household. Much of Sami museum subjects are organic. The Sami have used nature around them: wood, roots, grass, reindeer fur, and so on. The reindeers have always been important for the Sami people. The reindeer provide food and material for clothes and equipments made of bone and horn. In my area, Finnmark in northern Norway, we have not so many objects of the traditional Sami material culture from the period before 1945. During the withdrawal from Finnmark after World War II, the Germans burned down almost all of the buildings and homes. Everyone, both Norwegian and Samis, were forced to flee or were forced to evacuate to southern Norway. Many Samis chose to escape to the mountains, like my grandparents did. All they had, what was there, and their kids were able to carry. They escaped into the mountains, and they saw the red fire sky from our village when it was burning. All what Germans had spared was the church of my hometown, that is today one of Finnmark's few older buildings from the 19th century, built in 1807. Because much of our material culture was destroyed during the World War II, for us in Finnmark, this is one of the important reasons for why repatriation of our cultural heritage is very important for us. Repatriation involves different kinds of objects, important to indigenous people for different reasons. Often, this is relics that is prioritized. Today, there are many religious objects like drums possessed by others, foreign museums. Sacred drums were taken from the Sami people possessions by force. The spiritual experts called naiti, we don't use the term shaman, it's not appropriate. They were imprisoned and forced to accept Christianity and be baptized. The North Sami woman Lachukähpir, horn hat, was by the church in the 18th century associated with connection to the devil and was forbidden. The drums and also the horn hats were often burned, but some were taken to museums collections. The indigenous religion of the Samis is an important part of our history, although today it's almost gone. Religious items have therefore become the most important item to bring home to Sápmi through the process of repatriation. None of the Sami museums have nowadays any origin Sami drum in their possession. Some non-Sami museums have Sami objects. Some non-Sami museums have Sami objects, but they do not know anything about the object's context. Some not even don't know what a Sami cultural object looks like. In the catalogs, the information is very limited. Once I visited a European museum, I will not mention who, and I discovered a Sami sacred drum in the collection of musical instruments. I was really disappointed because our drums have never been used for entertainment or just for musical purposes, but rather they were and still are considered as sacred items. This is an important indigenous perspective in the debate of repatriation of Sami objects back to the Samis themselves. In 2011, Sami Parliament, together with the Sami Museum of Society, the Norwegian Folk Museum, Norsk Folkmuseum, and Cultural Museum, created a work group to develop strategies for a project for returning half of the Sami collections back to Sápmi. 2,000 Sami objects are to be returned to the 6 main Sami museums in Norway, according to the geographical belonging of the objects. This report was named Båstedet, meaning return in southern Sami language. And it was the basis for the signed agreement between the 2 Norwegian museums and the Sami Parliament in 2012 about repatriation of Sami cultural heritage. It must be emphasized that this repatriation do not concern human remains. One can mention that in 2011, the Sami Parliament insisted on reburial of human remains that were taken from the Skolt Sami graves for research in the 1950s. This was a matter between the Sami Parliament and the University of Oslo. Båstedet project shows willingness of the Norwegian authorities to give the Sami the rights to manage their cultural heritage. But it also means that the conservation of the Sami community must bear the responsibility for preservation and conservation of the objects. It might be a question of the objects do not have any major monetary value, but the items are still significant for us, because they tell us something about our past. Any object is a window into a time that is gone. It will have traces of manufacture and of use, parts of our traditional knowledge we may have lost. We can recover and revitalize. One of the intentions with repatriation is the possibility for restitution and revitalization. Repatriation is a way to give the origin society a possibility to restitute culture or parts of it that has been forgotten or taken by the means of the assimilation politics through time. If the museum do not have this item in their collection, this would not be a possibility today to display our history and cultural heritage. As Jukka Jokilehto stated in a workshop in Bergen, a long time ago, it's 1994, he said, conservation is not only keeping the material, but also recognizing the spirit, this non-physical essence and authenticity of the heritage and its relation with society. That's why connection between repatriation, conservation, and society is important. Sorry. For my master thesis, I took samples from the objects in Norsk Folkemuseum Sami collection to gain information about the pesticides in the collection waiting to be repatriated. Pesticides were at earlier time necessary to preserve organic material. Neither the staff responsible for the Sami collection in Norsk Folkemuseum nor the conservation department was aware of the scale of toxins in the collections. When my master thesis was presented to them, Norsk Folkemuseum began to address the challenges in the museum work in connection with pesticides and toxins. An objektkonservator was hired to the above-mentioned Bostede project. The aim was to go through the collection and assess the needs for conservation that should be carried out before an object would be removed from mass storage and eventually repatriated. As written in the project report in 2015, quotation, this work has since become more complicated by the discovery in the collection of pesticides and other toxic substances used in earlier times to combat insects. This presents a number of problems, including restrictions on handling the material, and will most likely also include a time-consuming and expensive process of removing such harmful substances from the objects. This work is by no means done, but it remains one of the core requirements from the Sami museums to the Norsk Folkemuseum since the time Bostede project started. It is important that all items returned to the Sami museums are cleaned, or rather more realistic, that efforts have been made to identify particular toxins and to reduce their concentration in the objects. It's disappointing that the project is not doing this investigation before returning the objects to the Sami museums, which have very limited resources to handle this issue. When working with my master, I realized that the health risk involved for people in museum work is, for example, cancer, damage to the central nervous system, and Alzheimer, and that had not been discussed and addressed. The health risks are, of course, dependent on exposing over time. This does not mean that the pesticides are all bad. Without pesticides, there probably would not be much of the organic material that the objects in museums' collections consist of. And had it not been for the Norwegian museums collecting this material, we probably wouldn't have anything to repatriate. Still, the pesticide problematic challenges the restitution of knowledge that these objects should bring back to the societies. To learn from the past, we need to study, for example, the technique involving in the making of these objects. At the same time, they must be handled with a lot of precautions. Sami museums do not have conservators to take care of the conservation. Therefore, is it important that the items return and conserved when they are returned? I was the Sami Museum Society representative in the working group and negotiated the Bostede Agreement. At the same time, I did my master's in conservation on the use of pesticide in the Sami objects in the museums. To me, it became important to include the challenges of pesticides in the Bostede Agreement. In the recent years, this issue has changed by taking out from the project the reducing of the pesticide concentration in the objects. When Norsk Folkemuseum, that is administrating the Bostede project, realized that the cost of pesticide analyzing and cleaning of the objects would be considerably large, they contacted Statens Arbeidsmiljøinstitutt, STAMI, to evaluate the issue in 2016. The result is that STAMI stated that the concentration could be small and is therefore not a safety risk if the objects are in boxes in the storage area, not used or touched. Anyway, that is not the intention with the repatriation, to keep the objects packed in a storage. The Sami museums are not happy at all that the pesticide analyzers are taken out of the project. As soon as the objects are transferred to the Sami museums, it is the Sami museums that have to take the cost of analyzing and cleaning. For the purpose of Bostede project in 2007 and 2018, commissions meetings were held, where museums objects were distributed between the Norsk Folkemuseum, Museum of Cultural History, and the Sami museums. In a few weeks, the 19th of June, in Kautokeino, our museums are getting the ownership of 736 museum objects by signing contracts, but not the objects yet. But in my view, and in the view of many of my colleagues, Bostede is a conservative repatriation model, comparing with other repatriation cases internationally. There are requirements for return in terms of the condition under which the objects shall be displayed and stored. The objects shall not be in the poorer preservation condition that they are at the Norsk Folkemuseum today. For the Sami museums, this will be difficult because most of the Sami museums do not have proper storage spaces, and those who have do not have climate-controlled storages. Most of them don't have climate-controlled showrooms. The dilemma is that the Norwegian government so far has been unwilling to provide the Sami museums with the funds to ensure that we can get the objects back and place them into good preservation conditions. Nothing will be returned from Norsk Folkemuseum before the requirements for safekeeping is fulfilled. Well, the storage needs at the Sami museums and the need for conservation and cleaning is estimated to cost about 37 million Norwegian kroners. This is about 4 million euros. And that was estimated for more than 4 years ago. The Sami museums and the Sami Parliament do not have this money to effectuate the repatriation. All efforts so far to make the Norwegian government realize their responsibility to make sure that the Sami Museum are and should be economically equal to the Norwegian museums have been in vain. Our Sami museums see the conservation issue in a different perspective compared to the mainstream and the majority society. As a Sami museum, we bring new thinking to museology, which we cannot see in Western museum model. We use our own traditional knowledge that has been used over generations, and the museum keep our methodologies and traditions alive. the pesticide issues that we inherit through repatriation may prevent us from gaining new material understanding or restitute forgotten methodology just because the pesticide identification and cleaning for reduced concentration has been left outside the Bostede project. The Sami Parliament, the Norwegian Museums, Sami Museum Society, and the Norwegian Museums Association continue to try to get the Norwegian government to recognize our constructual right for providing the necessary finances to implement the return of Sami heritage to the Sami people. And also, the Sami Museum should be given economic equality to the Norwegian museums, so the Sami museums will be able to take care of Sami cultural heritage. After all, the right to preserve and maintain our own heritage is the right to our own past, present, and future. Today, we are still hoping that the Norwegian government will take their responsibility to contribute and to make Sami museums capable for taking the repatriated objects into their collections. In June, as mentioned, the Sami Museum will get the contracts for ownership for the objects from the Norwegian Museum's collections. After 7 years working with the Bostede project, Norwegian government still don't recognize their participating in the ongoing repatriation in Norway. Hopefully, other countries that have museums who are working with repatriation from their collections have governments that support their work. In the meantime, life goes on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would just like to ask you, I suppose you share a lot of such experience with your Swedish colleagues at the Sami Museum in Jokkmokk, as for the relation with the old museum collections. What have you been speaking with them on this issues, on these matters?
No, actually, because this Bostede project is under the Norwegian Sami Museum because of the collection from the Norsk Folkmuseum. But we have discussed repatriation in general. We internationally are hoping that we are going to get Bostede number 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So actually, I think that also the Swedish Museum will have, they will have some questions to answer in the future.
I became very curious about, this is a detail, of course, what sort of method do you use for the cleaning of the pesticides that are in all those objects? I remember in the ethnographic museum in Stockholm, they had the same problems really with a lot of stuff, collections from China, not least.
Actually, it's impossible to clean everything, but a lot of the Sami objects have been treated with DDT. It's a powder, and so it lies in between the fibers. So it will come to the overflaten, come to the surface after a while. So if you can dry clean, vacuum, dry cleaning, you don't use anything that is wet. You can get the concentration down because of the particles that is coming to the surface, and you can take it away with vacuum. That's one of the methods. Yeah.
Well, I heard that in Stockholm they used the ultrasound in order to take away the pesticides. The ethnographic. Have you ever heard about that, or is it just a sort of mambo jumbo? Or
well, we have never used that on the pesticides. I know they have used they have some experiments, but I haven't considered using or reading more about that. It's also that since the Sami objects have been used to DDT, it's easier to do the cheapest way of cleaning. So everything that costs money is quite impossible for us to use. So vacuum, everybody have a vacuum machine, I think.
I'm sure there are questions. Have you got any questions?
Thank you for very interesting overview of the Norwegian case. First of all, how were these and when were these kind of artifacts collected? What was the kind of idea behind collecting them? First, and secondly, to reiterate what Magnus was saying, so do you have the kind of cooperation between the Sami in the different Nordic countries in order to both politically and culturally to press your case in dealing with the majority nation, if you will, in your country you're living in?
That was a lot of questions. Some of the collections that we are going to have repatriated now with the Bosteda is collected in the end of 1800s, 1800-tallet, 19th century, yeah, and also in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not that exclusive material. Some of the material that we really want to have back is from the 1500 century, 16th century, the drums and that kind of materials. That we know was collected by force. We have prisoned, Naidi have been prisoned, and we have court protocols that shows that what happened. So it's not a beautiful history. It's more like tragic history, you may say. So it's some documented material on that, and that material actually is spread all over Europe. Collaboration with the other Sami societies or the Samis on the other countries. We have the Sami Parliament have a what do you call it? They have they call it the Nordisk. Yeah, like it's a collaboration. I don't know how to say that in English. From the Sami parliaments, each Sami parliament president are in that team, so they have communications and they have priorities. So we have a really good collaboration between the Sami parliaments and also between the Sami museums. Because of the Bosteda project, actually, in the National Museum in Finland was inspired and actually are doing repatriation from the National Museum to the one Sami museum in Finland, into Saida Museum. So they actually, you can say that also between Norway and Sweden and Finland especially, they get inspired between the countries. If somebody does something more better, the other ones want to be better. You know, to compete, yeah. It's Norway and Sweden and Finland always have had that, I think, competing. So we are also competing about that.
I don't know if you have seen a very famous picture of the great Linnaeus, the botanist, when he was about to defend his dissertation in Leiden in Holland, that must have been in the 1720s. He was asked to be dressed like a Sami and with a drum. It's a very, very strange, picturesque view, of course. he made a very famous trip to the Samis, to Laponia. There is a very famous description of his travels in the north of Sweden, and it seems he collected, as a matter of fact, some precious objects. I mean, not least the drum that that appeared on this portrait of Linnaeus. So I mean, there have been a great obsession, one could say, in Sweden for a long time. I mean, some quite strange examples. The gift of Gustav III of a lot of reins that was sent to the Prince de Condé in Chantilly. So there was a whole farm of reindeers there, and it was looked after by its army, actually. But most of the reins died. So he went back to Sweden, actually. But I mean, in these days, the Samis were the most exotic thing that could ever been. That when people thought about the Great North, it was the Samis. It was not the Vikings. It was really the Sami. But this story about the reindeers coming to Chantilly is one of the most odd stories from the 18th century.
Well, I need to say that actually, if you have read Ottars berättning, have you read that? Okay, it's storytelling from the Vikings ages, and actually also the Vikings wanted to have boats from the Sami people because they were the good boat builders. So the Samis have always had some attention and always had been respected for their knowledge and everything. So I'm not surprised that we actually was quite popular at that time too. So it's, yeah.
So, else? Yes.
J'aurais une même question.
I have a question for the two speakers. Are there any Icelandic manuscripts in France in the collections? And madam, are there Sami objects at Quai Branly or other museums in France? Are you aware of such objects, Sami objects in French collections?
There are some. There are not many. I know that there are manuscripts in the Scandinavian collection in Paris. I think they are paper manuscripts, but I'm sure there are some because manuscripts were collected until the 19th century. So the travelers were often trying to find manuscripts. So I don't think there are many, but there are some. Yeah.
Yes, there are some Sami objects in one of the museums in Paris. I don't remember the name, but it's also some human remains from the Sami, also in France. So, like I said earlier, it's going to be a post to the 2 and 3 and 4 that is going to questions about the Sami collections that are abroad.
So, somebody else? Or we would rather conclude with an applause.
Thank you very much.